Welcome to Psychologist Talks. On today's episode, I want to talk a little bit about a really brief version of systems of oppression and how they come to be. And I want to keep it brief because I just want to keep this argument very simple. I'm not going to get into like the deep throes of how oppressive systems work, but I think sometimes there's a misunderstanding about what are they really. And I'll dispel the myth, the myth first, and then talk about what I think actually happens here. So, oppression is not usually caused by a bunch of bad actors. There can obviously be bad actors that catalyze and begin not so pleasant movements. You need to only look at Nazi Germany to appreciate how singular individuals that are then propped up by those who also seek power or those who also seek to peddle in hate, aka their latent fears that they cannot address. And it creates a movement that is truly steeped in not just oppression, but just vitriolic hatred or disdain or sadism, this desire to hurt and suppress others at the benefit of those with power. These do happen. They do happen. Do not mishear me. But a vast majority of the time, and especially because this is such a popular term, like, oh, it's such an oppressive system. It's like, well, geez, if you're like a naysayer, you're kind of a skeptic of this, like, why are there so many systems of oppression? It's like, well, because most of them aren't, Germany in the 1930s here. Like, we're talking about something a little bit more subtle. So there are always going to be a few bad actors somewhere in large systems. It's a guarantee. In the very least, they have their own personality pathology, these diagnoses that we don't give anybody because you're either disordered or you're not. Go see my episode on personality disorder. But they have their own pathology. Their psychology is kind of messed up, and they're greedy, they're selfish, whatever it might be. And they're self-serving, and they find their ways into positions of power, and they will, really condone negative practices and protect negative practices. So those people do exist. More often, though, as much as those people contribute, the overall system is not inherently evil. Well, not that evil is a subjective word. They're not bad or oppressive from the get-go. They usually start from a noble position, that there's some sort of initiative that actually makes a good amount of sense, and so they find a way to meet a need. And that's a noble goal. That's the beauty of capitalism. If there's a need and there's not sufficient supply, if there's a demand, there's not sufficient supply, then you create the supply and you can make some money off of that. Okay, that's not the end of the world. That's how all societies have existed since the dawn of time. Barter systems and the likes, mutual benefit. However, what often happens is as the system gets really comfortable and or they start making extra money, then the question is, how do I evolve and how do I stay in power? How do I continue to make the money that I want to make? Or as they get more access to the creation of policy or standards or procedures, then they begin to create systems that benefit them more than they benefit the consumer. And this, again, to a certain degree, is a natural rub in capitalism, that you are beholden to the consumer, but you also do need to protect yourself and how you run as a company. But eventually, as a system grows, this rub can go the wrong way, and it can become more about the company and the benefits of those in power in the company than it is of the consumer. Now, once again, it takes kind of not so savvy leaders and or unhealthy leaders to do this, or as systems are, they're providing some sort of product, a private insurance company, a tech company, whatever it might be, as they grow, they will often, one, have turnover of their leaders, and two, they become way more cooks in the kitchen. And inevitably, the more people you have in a room, the more people that you have in a system, the more hierarchy that you have in a system, the quality control of culture and leadership and this sort of idea of, how do we balance our needs versus the needs of the people that we serve, they begin to falter. I can tell you just from like a small standpoint, if I'm meeting with a group of people, a group of 5 people, there we go, versus a group of 20 people, I can tell you which one's more easy to manage as far as the zeitgeist or the psychology of the group. it's going to be the group of 5. It ain't going to be the group of 20. So this is not an easy task. But what ends up happening, there's this kind of diffusion of responsibility, and then people get into positions of power and they lose sight and they're not getting sufficient feedback. And then they start to create policies that are more self-protective. And then they get defensive when they get negative feedback, which reinforces the system that benefits them versus their employees or versus their consumer. And it just gets real slippery real fast. And in that process, legitimately good intentioned people, warm-hearted people that when you ask them, they are not lying, they're not trying to deceive, they will tell you they care about the consumers. They care about who they serve. They care about their providers. They care about their staff. And they believe it, and they're not lying to you. But their behavior tells you something very different. And then it becomes this sort of self-protective system that says, I'm going to protect the way that we work. Like, we'll change some, sure. I'll be happy to change a little bit. But at the end of the day, I want to preserve me and my position of power and how we do things, how we have come to know how to do things. And it becomes increasingly difficult to disrupt these systems. And in the process, this kind of psychology, this latent psychology in the system creates oppression. It creates systems of oppression. You need only look. The biggest exemplar I have of this is private insurance companies. I know they get a lot of heat these days, but they deserve that heat as much as there are tons of good actors in it. They have grown so large and so beyond their scope that the bureaucracy and the hierarchy in there has got to be mind-numbing. I cannot imagine working for one of these companies. But they have inadvertently contributed to a healthcare system and a mental health care system that is frequently oppressive in nature, that is not to the greater benefit of a consumer, and it is certainly not to the benefit of providers who have to deal with them. And they feel very entitled to this. I think a lot of them feel the rub, and you can definitely speak to leaders that are incredibly passionate, legitimately passionate about providing better care, but they sometimes lack the sort of insight to look at the system upon which they stand. You know, just because you're on the castle wall saying, I want to help you, doesn't mean that it's not incumbent upon you to question why you're on top of a castle wall to begin with. Why is that wall so high? Why can we not challenge the system and deconstruct it, or at least reconstruct it to be more accessible? This, to me, is how systems of oppression usually come to be. Good intentions that time and psychology and growth and changes in leadership create a self-protective environment that is more adversarial for those who depend on these people in power and begins to overtly benefit them or even subtly benefit them in a way that says, this is the way it operates. I'm unwilling to substantially change. And so oppression occurs and recurs. So I am sure there are experts out there that could probably speak more fluently to this than I, but this is the system that I have come to understand when it comes to the oppressive systems. This is how they come to be, usually quite innocuous, usually good intentioned, but at the end of the day, incredibly powerful and challenging to disrupt, especially when the people who are most capable of changing refuse to believe or admit that there's something oppressive about their system. They won't listen. They don't want to listen. It's too painful to listen. It's not their intent, so there's no way that can be the reality. So I hope if you are, on the receiving end of this, it's somewhat validating. I'm trying to be compassionate, though. That maybe it's frustrating here too, like me being compassionate to these systems of oppression. But I think it's important to note that this is not necessarily a war that has to be had. I mean, they need to be challenged. People in positions of power who are enabling oppression need to be challenged, and not necessarily lightly or like softly. They sometimes need to hear real talk. But demonizing them is also dangerous. There are certainly bad actors, but not all of them are bad actors, and so we need to be careful of that. If you are a leader, then the question is, how are you using your power? And how are you getting legitimate feedback? Not skewed feedback, not the feedback that makes you most comfortable. Maybe take in the slightly critical stuff, but then deny the stuff that is more critical or more, steeped in anger and frustration. How are you going to listen? Because, while, some people say, sure, it's a little bit of a fad to call people out and just call names and say, you're an oppressive system, and you don't need to take all of that in. What are you doing if 5 people say it if you're in a small company? What if 20 people are saying it? What if 20% of your workforce say it? What if 20% of your consumers say it? At what point is it enough to listen and question not just what you're doing in the here and now, but systemically the castle you have created? How many people are outside the castle walls? It's an incredibly challenging thing to ask yourself, and this is why consulting and working with folks who know these things can be helpful. Of course, then I can go into a whole other tangent I won't go into, because sometimes those people are also more about profit than meaningful change. But I digress. So, as always, thank you for watching. Thank you for listening. My apologies to the experts on systems of oppression and anything that I left out that might be really important. But otherwise, thank you.